Do you know how much of Zomato is owned by foreigners versus Indians?
If I have to take a guess, 40% by foreigners, 60% by Indians.
It's a little bit higher than that. 54% is owned by foreigners and the rest by Indians. But the thing is that Zomato is actually the second most valuable startup in that space, food delivery. So the most valuable company, Swiggy, guess what the ownership is with them? And they're not public too, so it's going to be a little bit higher.
60 by foreigners?
Higher than that, yeah. It's 85% is owned by foreigners. That's huge. But that's actually not uncommon. Across India's entire startup ecosystem, a lot of the startups, the top startups, are actually owned in large part by foreigners. So for example, 70% of Paytm is owned by foreigners. Another company, Oyo, very popular, used to be extremely valuable. I think their valuation has gone down quite a bit, but they're owned 55% by foreigners. Cred is another one, 50% owned by foreigners. And this is kind of across the board. Most of India's top startups that aren't bootstrapped are owned by foreigners, at least 50% of the company owned by foreigners. And in this debate, I want to explore why that is. Why is it that there's more money coming from outside of India into Indian startups than there is domestically coming into startups from Indian investors? Because that should be the case. For example, in the United States, most of the money that goes into American startups is coming from American investors. But in India, that's just not the case. And if you look at the cap tables of most of these top startups, it's largely companies based in the United States, China, Singapore, Dubai, and a couple of other countries. And so I want to look at this Ernst & Young report real quick here. 2020, they said that of the $111 billion long-term capital investment going into Indian companies between 2017 and 2019, more than 80% was foreign capital. Now, I wasn't able to find any data after 2020, so that 80% might have gone up, it might have gone down. But my thesis here, the reason why I think Indian startups are raising more FDI than they are raising domestic capital, is because of the risk-averse nature of Indian business culture, which is a byproduct of Indian culture at large. India, in general, when it comes to money, when it comes to finances and spending, is risk-averse. It's more conservative. People are more frugal. They're less likely to spend money and throw money at things that might be considered a little bit risky, a little bit of a gamble. And that actually does find its way into the investment community in India as well. That's my thesis. And there's three major points that I want to quickly unpack to understand why that's the case. So the first is the familial nature of Indian society. India is really largely built around families. And, in Canada, where I'm from, or the United States, it's a much more individualistic culture. So you might be thinking about your spouse, you might be thinking about your children, whereas in India, you're thinking about your parents, you're thinking about your uncles and aunts, your cousins. Everybody is one big family in India. And I think this also does trickle down to the business culture as well, because it's just the way that people are brought up. It's the way that they think from the day that they're born, right? And so it seeps into every aspect of business culture here in India. The second major reason is that India has had a really difficult past and has experienced some pretty hard times. Poverty in the past, which still lingers. You've also got colonization, which eventually turned into socialism and now finally capitalism. So there have been big sweeping changes that have happened in the country. And I think even to this day, people think, maybe something's going to happen in the future, right? Things might change. So it's better to save my money and be conservative, which is why I think in India, credit card adoption is still pretty low, because credit cards are considered to be a risky thing and you don't want to take a risk. That's part of the culture. Saving money is also way more common than it is in Canada, where I'm from, or the United States. And then I think also consumerism takes a hit here as well, because it ends up being less pervasive than other countries where people will just buy stuff on a whim without even thinking about the price or consequences. And then the third point is that India is a bit of a low trust country. People in India are just less likely to trust each other than other countries around the world. And so as an investor, if you are a low trust person, you're less likely to trust other people. Then why would you trust a startup founder that you're about to give millions and millions of dollars to, right? And so that can actually make deals slower. There's maybe more due diligence put into things. And also maybe deals are just more likely to fall through in general, because, and this is actually also why I think IITs are such an important filter for investors, because they're very low trust, right? And so if you come from an IIT, that's just an easy way for them to say, oh, okay, that's the stamp of trust. That's the stamp of approval. So those are my points. That's my thesis. Now you tell me why I'm wrong.
So I think I agree with a lot of the points you made there. But when we compare countries like these on such parameters, I think we have to understand the perspective on the timeline, right? So the entire startup ecosystem for India is very, very new. So one example that I like to think of to basically compare India and US is when Apple raised their seed funding, right? They raised $250K check in 1977, 1 year after it was started.
Who did they raise that money from?
There was an angel investor called Mike Markula, right? And when I try to compare India of that time with US, it was a socialist closed economy where even to start a basic factory, you needed tens of licenses, right? So, and then we have the example of Infosys that came in the 1980s, sort of called the India's first startup, but it took them 3 years to import a computer, right? So I think it was only after the reforms of 91 and basically the dot-com boom in the US that Indians understood this concept of free market. Two people can just from their dorm room can start a company and then compete with these big giants, right? So on the timeline, it's like what was possible in the US in 60s and 70s, it wasn't possible in India till like 2005, right? So I see a 25 to 30 years of gap between India and US's startup journey.
So your thesis would be that at a later point, once India has sort of reached that same level as the US was back in the day, then we will actually see more domestic investment into startups as compared to FDI.
Yes.
Okay. Well, you're right. I mean, that's very true. I think the word startup itself was invented in the United States, so they have the maximum head start above everybody else. And then I think even China, sort of the amount of FDI that was going into Chinese companies really began around the early 90s, like 91, 92, whereas India, if you look, like you can't really consider the startup ecosystem to have actually begun until around 2005. So that's very true. I think India is the furthest behind in terms of the top 3 largest startup ecosystems in the world. India had the latest start. But I would still say in a hypothetical situation, if you took India and you took the United States and you put the starting line at the same point for both of those countries, I still think that we would have a similar problem here where more money would be invested through FDI into India than would be domestic investment as compared to the United States. And also if you set the GDP at the same level too, because that's also a big factor in this equation, right? If GDP is less for India and higher for the United States, then obviously there's going to be more domestic investment. But if you set all of those variables at the same point, I still think the conservative nature of Indian culture is going to generally have a negative impact on the growth and the speed at which the Indian startup ecosystem grows. And I kind of feel like this is intuitive because if you look at a large majority of 20-somethings in India, this is something I've seen personally, most people go for their engineering. That's actually like a phrase. You go for your engineering, and you won't hear anyone say that phrase outside of India. It's not a thing, right? And the reason why people go for their engineering or they go and take government exams, they want security. They want low risk. And they're actually choosing that over happiness, right? They don't want to run after their dreams. They don't want to take risks and make mistakes and have fun. It's like, no, I'm going to go do my engineering. I'm going to get a safe job. I'm going to do my government exam. I'm going to work for the government. Not because I want to, not because I think that I'm going to be fulfilled as a human being in those jobs. It's because that's the safe option. And this isn't just me saying this. This is actually, I'm going to pull up the India Development Review here. 81% of youth report having the skills and knowledge needed to start a business, which is amazing, right? So many Indian young people do believe that they can actually get into startups, but 56% of them fear failure and they don't end up actually going into business. This pushes them to opt for jobs instead, and they basically lack the confidence to start up. And I think this is this is really sad because I love seeing people who do take risks. I'm a risk taker. I dropped out of college because I was like, you know what, this sucks. I don't like academics. I'm gonna go do my own thing. And now here I am, right? I'm enjoying this success with our YouTube channel, which is the biggest in its category. And I want to pull up another study here from the Quarterly Journal of Economics. And what we can see here is that India falls moderately south of the global risk-taking baseline. It's less likely for Indians to take risks even than people in China. The United States is ever so slightly north of the baseline. Canada, my home country, is even higher. It's even further north of the baseline. And so all of this actually trickles down, right? This risk aversion trickles down to Indian VC firms and Indian investors. Now, I would say that Indian investors and investors in general really are going to be above the national baseline of whatever country they're residing in. India is no exception, right? Investors do have money, most of them, right? If you're an angel, you have personal wealth. If you're a VC, you're educated enough to get a job at a VC firm. And so you're going to have some money to play with. You're going to have more security and you're going to feel more comfortable taking risks. But I still would say that India in general, the culture of risk aversion is still there. And I don't say that to put India down. I'm not trying to mock India. I'm just painting a picture of what the reality is. And in fact, in many situations, I would say that this is highly beneficial. For example, the world was kind of laughing, mocking the United States when this whole Theranos thing happened, right? They were throwing like upwards of $700 million at this woman who ended up sort of scamming them all, and there was actually no product to show for it. Same thing with FTX, right? There was a product, but there was a lot of shady things happening in the back end, and a lot of people lost a lot of money. Same thing with Celsius. I mean, there's tons of examples, right? The United States is kind of the land of people getting scammed, of Ponzi schemes and these crazy meltdowns where people lose tons of money, whereas India tends to be able to avoid a lot of those situations just by the nature of the fact that India is a more risk-averse country, and so people are less likely to get scammed like that. However, I would say that the net objective outcome of risk aversion in the Indian startup ecosystem is just slower growth and also less Indian ownership of startups. Yes, the United States gets scammed a lot of these bad things happen, but the larger picture is that the ecosystem grows more quickly because people are less risk averse, right? They're more willing to gamble with their money.
Yeah, I agree with that, right? And that reflects the socioeconomic aspect of the US. People there have more options. They can choose to follow their passions. But India, there's a different story here, right? And as you said, less Indians choose to do startup even after having the qualification needed for that. I think as a society becomes more prosperous, they have more options. They can take these bets that you talked about earlier, right? And I think another point that you made, that Indian investors are more risk averse, they take less risks. I think there it's like risk always goes with the reward, right? If I as an investor see that by taking a big risk, I can make big reward, I will invest or I'll put my money there, right? Again, I want to explain that by taking an example. I talked about Mike Markula earlier. He invested in the Apple. Do you know how Mike made his money?
I don't even know who Mike is, but tell me.
So he was one of the earliest employees of Fairchild Semiconductors, right? That was a semiconductor startup in the US. Sort of like the first generation of startups in the US back in 60s.
Like the American equivalent of Infosys.
Exactly, right? And then another example I like to think of is PayPal's founder, Peter Thiel, right? He made his money by selling PayPal, and now he is invested in hundreds of startups. And I see the same thing happening in India, right? So first generation of Indian startups, you can think of examples like Shadi.com, you can think of InfoEdge, right? Company that runs Jeevan Saathi and Naukri, such startups.
India Mart would be another one.
India Mart is another example. So they made their money from the first generation of Indian startups, and then those people became the angels for the next generation of Indian startups, right? Anupam Mittal, for example, invested 1 crore rupees in Ola back in 2011. I mean, if he wouldn't have done that, there would be no Ola, right? Same with InfoEdge. They were the early investors in Zomato and Policy Bazaar. So I see this is like a cycle, right? You make money from the ecosystem, then as a way of giving it back, you invest in the next generation of startups. Same thing happened in the US. Same thing is happening in India right now. It's just that being so early in the game or being so late in the game, India has just seen 2 of those cycles, right? Whereas US has seen like 6, 7 of those cycles. So as more and more time passes, more and more Indians become part of this ecosystem, more and more people make money from them, they'll become angels to the next set of startups.
Yeah, I think we're seeing that with people like, for example, Kunal Shah, right? He's sort of a crazy prolific angel investor.
Yeah, I mean, another example if I have to think of other than Kunal Shah is Sachin Bansal, right? That's like the second generation of startups. Yeah. And if you see the Crunchbase page of Sachin Bansal, after selling Flipkart to Walmart in 2017, since then he has invested in over 19 startups. So what I'm seeing here is you make money, you become part of the cycle, and then you, as a way of giving back, you invest in more startups. And this circle becomes bigger and bigger with every cycle.
True. You're correct. I mean, the cycle will continue. The amount of angels will increase over time. Second generation, third generation, fourth generation, that's how it works. But I also think that if you look at the number, this is an interesting metric to look at, the number of entrepreneurs in your country who go on to become investors and what that says about your citizens. So let's take a look at the United States. The US has 363,000 active angel investors, whereas India only has 26,000 angel investors. And the conclusion that you would jump to, right, is that, well, it's just, it's the second generation, the third generation, right? We still need time. But let's take a close look at the number of entrepreneurs in the country as well. So the United States has roughly 51.5 million entrepreneurs, and this data is coming from Babson College's Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, by the way. Now let's go back to that article that I pulled up earlier from IDR to take a look at the India situation. So only 5% of India's entire population falls into the category of entrepreneurs, and a large majority of these people would be very small business owners. And this percentage is actually among the smallest in the world. 5% of your entire population is a very small ratio to have for the number of entrepreneurs in your country. 5% is only 70 million people out of a population of 1.4 billion people. And actually, this is very close to the widely agreed upon number of 76 million. So we'll just use that number going forward. 76 million entrepreneurs in India versus 51.5 million entrepreneurs in the United States. That's more than 20 million more entrepreneurs in India, which seems like a great number, right? Good job. But now if we do the math here, this means that only 0.03% of Indian entrepreneurs go on to become angel investors, while 0.7% of American entrepreneurs become angel investors. This means that Indian founders are 23 times less likely to become angel investors. Why is that? Well, my theory is that it's because investing is high risk, right? This is a high risk activity. And so even though entrepreneurs are inherently, they're already doing risky behavior, right? Especially if they're getting into startups, that's like extremely high risk. 9 out of 10 startups fail. But when they exit, when they finally finish up their first startup or second startup, they're more likely to just walk away with a bag full of money and retire, maybe build a house, buy a nice car, whatever, maybe move abroad, I don't know, right? They're more likely to do that than they are to actually reinvest their money as an angel investor into the ecosystem. And this is sad to see. I wish that there were more people like the men that you mentioned earlier, Kunal Shah, I think is amazing, Sachin Bansal, incredible, Anupam Mittal, great people, right? But that is literally, these people are literally 0.03% of the entrepreneurs that are pouring their money back into the ecosystem. So I like to think of it this way. For every Ratan Tata, amazing guy, he's super active in the startup world, especially at his age. It's incredible. His portfolio consists of 42 startups, and this is his personal portfolio as an individual. For every Ratan Tata, there are 99 Mukesh Ambanis and Gautam Adanis who have no personal startup portfolio to speak of. They just don't do it. They don't invest in startups in a personal capacity.
You're right. They don't directly invest into them, and they have stayed away up until now to invest into Indian startups, but that's fast changing now. Reliance, for example, a few years back announced that they have a 5,000 crore rupees fund that they used to invest every year now into Indian startups. And same with other people, right? Even though they don't directly invest into it, they invest through their family offices. And another thing that's like much bigger thing that's happening right now that I don't think a lot of people realize is Indian government just allowed big public insurance funds and pension funds like EPFO and LIC. They've allowed them to invest into Indian startups.
They weren't allowing them up until now?
No, they just allowed them. It's been like 2 years. And so what I see happening is going in the future that most of these late stage funds, these 100 million rounds we hear of, instead of someone like SoftBank leading them, we'll see LIC or Axis Bank Mutual Fund, these people leading these rounds.
Yeah, I've actually seen this in the United States where it's not just angel investors or VC firms. You also have money coming in from private colleges and family houses as well, going into startups. And that's like a pretty common thing. A lot of startups will go and reach out to these groups, these organizations. So now that's going to be possible in India, you're saying?
Yeah. And I think one factor that has kept these institutions away is the entire bad experience they had in like 2021 with so many failed IPOs, Paytm, Zomato, Nykaa. But I think that's also changing now. Startups like Swiggy, startups like Policy Bazaar, they're focusing on their unit economics. They're focusing on becoming profitable first and then doing their IPO so that public has trust into them. So what I see happening is in 2025, 2026, will have a series of these successful startups which will instill confidence in these big institutional investors in India.
Well, I certainly hope that happens. I'm long on India, so I know a lot of my arguments here make it seem like I'm just trying to pick India apart. But really what I want to see here is Indian investors investing more into Indian startups, domestic investors. That's really what I'm trying to put out. So my hope in the next, say, 5 to 10 years is that 0.03% of Indian entrepreneurs that end up becoming angel investors increases at least to, like, say, 0.1%. If that kind of change could happen, 0.2% would be incredible, right? But I think the reason that we haven't seen a lot of this up until this point is that the American ecosystem has a lot of these role models. You mentioned Peter Thiel before. There's also Paul Graham. There's a bunch of other very famous investors who used to be entrepreneurs and now they're billionaires, right? If not at least 100 millionaire guys that are pouring money into startups. And I think India still is at a stage where we don't have as many of those massive role models. I think probably the closest thing that we would have is maybe like a Kunal Shah, right? I mean, he's cutting deals over WhatsApp. So that's the kind of culture that he's bringing. And I think that's inspiring a lot of people. And we will see more people following his example. And so hopefully people like Kunal Shah and others, as you were saying, second generation or even third generation investors will sort of lead the charge here, and we'll see that number of 0.03% going up to 1 or 0.1 or 0.2%. That's my hope anyways. But anyways, we got to wrap this video up. So thanks so much for tuning in, listening to our debate, and let us know who won. We didn't really ask that last time, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Was it Caleb or was it Pankaj? Who won the debate? Thanks so much.